Welcome to our final week of Fear Not. We've been in this series exploring the most common command in all of Scripture, which is fear not, or do not be afraid. Now, one of my earliest memories of fear was when I was a little boy and I was with my dad. My dad took me to an Iowa Hawkeyes basketball game, and after the game, we were coming out of Carver Hawkeye Arena. It was very crowded, as you can imagine, and for just a split second, I lost where my dad was. And I remember the feeling of panic kind of surging up within me. And then I saw him walking in front of me, and I ran up and I slipped my hand in his hand. And then I looked up, only to realize that the man looking back down at me was not, in fact, my dad. But about that moment, my dad did actually appear, and my suspicion is that he knew where I was all along and that I was never in any real danger. But that's the thing about fear. Listen, fear is based on our perception of circumstances, which is not always the way things actually are. Fear is based on what we think is happening, which is not always what is actually happening. And see, in that moment at the basketball game, I felt that surge of panic, but that was simply because I perceived that I had lost my dad, when in fact, my dad had not lost me. Many lives are defined by fear because we do not see things as they actually are. Our brains are very good at filling in gaps. We create stories, we create narratives, and it's easy for us to go with that narrative instead of the one that's actually true. And so we have to ask ourselves, which story am I going to live out? Which one am I going to believe? The one that I've made up or the one that's actually true? Today's text comes from Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 10. I want to invite you, if you have a Bible, to open to that with me. As we get there, I'll just let you know that these verses take place on the very first Easter. This is Resurrection Sunday. Jesus has just been crucified the past Friday, and some women who are both named Mary come to visit the tomb. Now, I want you to notice that the word for fear appears in this passage, in these 10 verses, 4 times. And the way each one is used is going to tell us something about the nature of fear and courage. And so we're going to read the text, and we're going to count each one as they come up. Here's what it says. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid, there's one, of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid," there's 2. "For I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, he is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he is risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I've told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, there's 3, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid," there's 4. "Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." So as you may have noticed, 4 different times we see afraid or fear or a word related to it. And what we see in this passage is what I like to think of sort of an evolution of fear. It begins with terror, but then it ends in courage. And at each stage along the way, we learn something that we didn't know before about the circumstances. Listen, this text is going to help us all move from terror to courage today. It's going to help us all move from terror to courage today. And it's going to do that by taking us through 3 stages of fear. The first stage is what we'll call terror. Okay? Terror is what the guards at the tomb experienced when that angel shows up in verse 4. It says, the guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. So this is kind of a paralyzing fear. Maybe you know what this feels like. And the original language is very blunt. I mean, then our translation gets it right. In the Greek, it says they became like dead ones, or they became like dead men. They actually looked like they had died. These men were paralyzed with fear. And notice the reason why. I mean, obviously seeing an angel would be scary to most anybody, I would imagine. And yet, how come they fell down like they were dead, but the women apparently didn't? I mean, these were hardened Roman soldiers. These guys could take you out with their pinky finger. They'd probably seen battle before. These guys were tough. Yet they fell down like they were dead. I think it's because they filled in the gaps. They told themselves a story that wasn't true. Their story told them that whatever this meant, this angels appearing with, I don't know if they thought they were being abducted by aliens or what they were thinking. Whatever they thought it was bad news, when in fact it was the greatest news they could possibly imagine. Jesus is alive. They were defined by fear because they didn't see things as they actually were. Now, I don't scare easily. People have often tried to jump out and scare me, and unfortunately I kind of usually disappoint them. But there was one night that I went out into my garage, and as I opened the door to my garage, going into this pitch black space, I heard a very loud hissing sound. Now, just a few months before that, we had seen a raccoon about 3 feet outside our back door, just kind of sitting there staring into our house, and it was at like 3 in the afternoon. It was in the middle of the day. And so ever since that moment, I always had kind of this thought in the back of my head. I'm like, okay, we've got like a rabid, crazy raccoon living on our property somewhere. I wonder when he's going to turn up again. And that was my first thought. I was like, oh man, the raccoon here, he's going to get me. And so I jumped back and I turned the light on, and much to my relief, it was just the sound of a box scraping against the garage floor as I opened the door. There was no raccoon there, at least not that time. But it did cause my heart to stop for a second. I experienced terror in that moment. Listen, terror equals fear minus faith. Okay? Terror, this is the place where the guards were. They didn't believe that Jesus was who he said that he was. Therefore, the only response available to them when an angel appears out of nowhere is terror. The terror mindset is all is lost. This is what we think when we're in terror. All is lost. Now, I think that we can all relate to those guards. I think probably collectively as a world we can relate to those guards right now. We are living in scary times. It's very difficult for us to trace hope right now. But listen, fear does not have to stay in the terror stage. There is a moment where God moves us into something beyond terror, something new. It's still fear, but it's no longer defined by terror. Listen, we read about it starting in verse 5. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay, then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Okay, so this is a fear that has hope inserted into it. See, the women at this point, they couldn't make complete sense of all that was happening, which means that they're still scared, but now there's something different. Now they're hopeful as well. It says they were frightened, but also filled with great joy. Did you know that those two emotions could coexist? I don't usually think of fear and joy going together any more than I think of pineapple going on pizza. Know what I'm saying? And yet here they are together, joy and fear, side by side. At this point in history, in the story, the women heard the angel. They've seen that the tomb is empty. The story has moved us from terror to a different place. It's moved us into stage 2, which I call wonder. Stage 1 is terror. Stage 2 is wonder. The women knew that there's something going on. There's something more happening here. And now all they could do was hope that it was true, because listen, wonder equals fear plus hope. Wonder equals fear plus hope. About 2 years ago, I was on a phone call with my district superintendent, who kind of oversaw me as a pastor. And he asked me this question. He said, "Phil, have you ever thought about church planting?" I was honest with him. I said, "Well, yeah, I have actually, but it terrifies me." At which point my district leader proceeded to kind of slap me around a bit in Christian love. He said, "Phil, I believe in you. What are you waiting for?" And you know, the only answer I had for him was, "I'm too scared." But eventually I realized this. For a Jesus follower, "I'm too scared" is never a good enough answer. And in that moment, hope was inserted into my fear. And I started to wonder, maybe I could actually do this. I wonder if we could actually plant a church. And as we prayed, God started to bring connections together. Really amazing things started to happen that started to confirm that I think this might be what God is calling us to do. See, the wonder mindset is, could it be? Could it be? When the women saw the angel, they were expecting only to see a tomb. They didn't have any hope that Jesus was going to come back to life. This wasn't anything they were expecting. They knew just as well as you and I that dead bodies stay dead. They weren't expecting Jesus to come back to life. I mean, as they were following him when he was still alive, they were hoping that he would be a great leader, a military leader, that he'd perhaps lead a revolt against their Roman oppressors or something like that. But now their teacher had been killed. He had been shamed. He was dead. The game was over and their team had lost. They had given up hope. They were not expecting a miracle. And so when the angel appeared, it was completely out of nowhere to them. They weren't expecting it. They probably didn't really know what to make of it, but it left them wondering, could it be? Now, I believe that this is a stage where we often get stuck as followers of Jesus. Because even though at this stage it's clear that God might be up to something, we often box ourselves in here and we revert back to what's most comfortable and we never take that next step of faith. Listen, so many people have felt the nudge of the Holy Spirit in their lives. They felt God pulling them into something deeper, something greater, God calling them to new heights, but they just haven't taken that next step. They've sat for years in this wonder stage. Gee, I wonder if God might be calling me to this. But they never get the courage to actually take that step of faith. We're stuck in the stage of wonder, and we never make it to stage 3, which is courage. Stage 3 is courage. But listen, wonder turns to courage only after a bold step of obedience. Wonder can turn to courage only after a bold step of obedience. You see, the women saw the angel. They heard the report that Jesus had arisen, but they still had not seen him yet. They had still not seen the risen Jesus. They still had to obey what the angel told them. Verse 7, he says, then go quickly and tell his disciples he has risen from the dead. The angel says to the women, you got to go tell the disciples that Jesus has risen from the dead. Now, that might sound like a simple command. I mean, who wouldn't want to at that point, right? Well, it's not quite as simple as we'd like to think. I mean, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of these women, which is hard to do across these many centuries, especially hard if we're men right now. But we have to realize that women's testimonies 2,000 years ago were often considered worthless. In fact, there's one ancient historian from the time. His name is Josephus. And Josephus wrote a lot of stuff. A lot of it's kind of crazy. This one is especially, but as was typical of his day, he argued that women should not be considered credible witnesses in a court of law. Here's what he says. He says, but let not a single witness be credited, but 3 or 2 at the least. And those such whose testimony is confirmed by their good lives, but let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex. When he says levity, he's just saying that according to him, women, they're kind of frivolous, they don't take things seriously and that sort of thing. Now, obviously, Josephus is crazy, right? But what's important for us to realize here is that the Bible completely pushes against, it completely abolishes that cultural trend, that cultural precedent that women couldn't be trusted or their testimonies weren't worthy. The Bible completely pushes against that because it is the women who are given the news of Jesus' resurrection first. And they're the ones who are commanded to report it to the disciples. I mean, I don't know where the disciples were at this point. They're off somewhere, probably still crying and bemoaning the fact that their teacher had died. But listen, as one scholar puts it, he says, this detail is definitely not one that ancient Christians would have invented. It did not appeal to their culture. They wouldn't have just made this up. If you're just kind of making up a gospel story, you wouldn't put this in there because nobody would believe it if you did. So the women now have to choose. Are they going to bust in on the disciples who are grieving the loss of Jesus, risk being mocked and ridiculed, probably being told they belong in the loony bin? Or are they going to take that step of courage and do what the angel asked them to do? Because remember, wonder turns to courage only after a bold step of obedience. They chose to take that step of obedience, and listen, only then did they see the risen Christ. Verse 8 says, so the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. Greetings, he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me. These women, they became the first people to tell others the good news that Jesus is alive. In other words, these women became the first people to share the gospel. Listen, the final nail in the coffin of fear is pounded in the moment that the women see Jesus. But notice it only happened after they took that radical step of faith and obedience. So 2 summers ago, we were still in the wonder stage of trying to discern if we were going to plant this church or not. But we took a step. My wife Natalie and I, and then Pastor Megan and her husband Jim, we all took a trip down to Des Moines because we had felt like God was leading us to come plant a church here. And we spent a weekend here, just fell in love with this city. Absolutely loved it. Fell in love with the Drake neighborhood. We knew, man, if we could plant a church there, that would be amazing. And that was before we even knew about the Playhouse, or if it was going to work out or not. And God just let things fall into place and really brought our dreams to life in that time. But I remember after we took that trip and we kind of decided, yeah, I think that we're called to plant a church there. That night I'm lying in my bed and I mean, it was a little overwhelming and exciting, but I remember lying there and I'm praying and I'm saying, Jesus, I can't believe that we're going to do this, but we don't even have a church name. I don't even know what this church is going to be like. Jesus, what should I call this church? What should the name of this church be? And something a little bit personal about me is that when I pray, I often like to use my imagination. I actually have a place that I often go to with Jesus, and it happens to be a big library, I guess because I'm a nerd, and I often sit at a table like this one, and I sit across from Jesus, and we talk. And in that moment, I'm lying in my bed and I'm praying, and I say, Jesus, what do you want me to call this church? And I remember in my mind, I saw him just look down at the table and back up at me, and then I knew then the answer. Table Church, there's room. I went to sleep and woke up the next day. I thought, well, that's a pretty cool name. I wonder if other people will like it or not. So I shared it with my wife, Natalie, and I said, hey, what do you think about Table Church? She thought that was pretty neat, but then she started reminding me of some things. She said, you know that the cooks, that Megan and Jim, they have a whole thing about tables, right? Did you know that? I'm like, I know they have a table. Who has a thing about tables? And she said, you know that I got Megan a mug for Christmas last year that says, we've got room at our table, right? You remember that, don't you? I said, nope, I had no idea. She said, you know that Megan has a website where she's kind of curated resources for people to follow Jesus called roomatourtable.com, right? I said, no, not really. You know, there's so much more to that story too. The Wisemans and the Cooks had gathered every Monday night for years around a table to have dinner together as families because we lived on the same street. And I mean, Table Church had been born long before that trip to Des Moines. We just didn't realize it. See, Jesus had given us a name and a vision for a church that the Cooks had already embraced in their own lives. In that moment, that was a moment for me that I knew that God was in this. That was the moment that I went from fear to courage. It was the moment that Jesus showed up. There was no longer any doubt in my mind. God is doing something here. The resurrected Christ is in this. Listen, courage equals Jesus over fear. Courage equals Jesus over fear. And after Jesus appeared to the women, he appeared to his disciples, and here's the words that he gave them. He said, then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. All authority and power has been given to Jesus, the resurrected Jesus. And once we come face to face with him, our fear turns to courage. The courage mindset is, I will go. I will go. I will obey what Jesus told me to do when he said, go and make disciples. I will go and make disciples wherever Jesus tells me to go. Listen, at Table Church, our vision has never been to plant a church. Our vision has been to start a discipleship movement in our city, in our region, and beyond. Our hope is to raise up leaders with the courage to go and to obey Jesus by making disciples and teaching them to obey everything he's commanded, just like he told us to do. Listen, Table Church has existed for just 6 months now. But today, there are already over 40 people in our discipleship pathway from Table Church alone. There's others who are involved from across the country too. And that number is growing even through this pandemic. More people are being discipled even during these times. So these are people who are involved in this pathway, either discipling somebody or being discipled, but these are people who have decided that Jesus is worth following with their whole lives, that Jesus offers a compelling vision of life, that Jesus is the master, the teacher, the Lord, that they want to submit everything in their life to. And so they've decided to take seriously this call to make disciples. Following Jesus doesn't stop during a pandemic. In fact, it is in these times that we believe Jesus empowers us for love, for courage, and for ministry. Listen, when we encounter the risen Christ, our fear is transformed into the courage to go. Last week, we learned about Jesus calming the storm while the disciples were out in the boat. That boat was the place where it was the place for the disciples' deepest fear, but it was also the place where the disciples realized who Jesus really was. It's the place where the power of Jesus is seen firsthand as he comes to us walking on the water. And so we asked you the question, why do you still follow Jesus? Why do you still follow Jesus? There's all sorts of reasons today to not follow Jesus. There's all sorts of reasons to wander or to not even believe in God. Why do you still follow Jesus today? I want to ask you that question. If you're a follower of Jesus, why? We challenged you last week to go back to the boat, to remember that time where God calmed the storm in your life, where God made your fears dissipate. The best weapon against fear is to claim the truth of what Christ has done in you. And so that's what we did last week. We asked you to share your boat story, we called it. And that's just the moment that you realized that God was truly in the boat with you. And many of you wrote in, and some of the results are really, really powerful. In fact, there's one woman who told of a time that her husband nearly died. When they rushed him to the hospital, the best surgeon for the procedure that he needed wasn't supposed to be there at the time, but he happened to be there because he was filling in. And so he did the surgery. And then during the difficult days of recovery that came afterward, God spoke powerfully to this woman about her need for faith. And he did something amazing between her and her husband actually became a believer through that. Another shared about a time that they were in a time of prayer. And Jesus showed up in a really palpable, really tangible, really powerful way. And Jesus healed some inner wounds that they'd been carrying since they were 9 years old. And that was their boat story. Two people actually shared about a time where they were actually on a boat. Both of them were canoeing. These are two separate stories, but a storm came up and they sensed the Lord protecting them through it, even though it was terrifying. One man said this, I'll quote him, he says, "On the day that my wife's mother died, I watched her reach her hand out to God. She lifted her hand in the air in spite of being unresponsive for days. Then she put her hand down and did not breathe again. In that moment, I knew that God had taken her home." The fact is, God is still working today, even in a world wrecked by coronavirus. We have to believe as followers of Jesus that death truly has lost its sting, as difficult as it is perhaps to see. Death does not have the last word today. Now, some of you don't have a boat story. You're thinking to yourself, I don't have that moment where God showed up. Maybe your boat story is right now. Maybe you're not following Jesus, but you're realizing right now, perhaps in the chaos of our world, chaos of your life right now, you're realizing that there's something that you need, and that something is Jesus. Listen, if you'd like to follow Jesus, we would love to help you in that. And in fact, on your connection card, you can check the box that says I decided to follow Jesus. If you do that, we will connect with you. If you're watching on Facebook, just remember the connection card's in the comments. And if you check that box, we will find somebody to walk alongside you in this journey of following Jesus. This is what we call discipleship. It just means I want to become a student of Jesus, and I want to learn how to follow him with everything I've got. Because at Table Church, we believe that nobody should have to journey alone. Would you pray with me? Well, Jesus, you give us courage over fear because you have conquered the greatest enemy that there is, and that is sin and death. And so today we claim that truth in our lives. We claim that truth over our world. And Lord, even in the chaos and the despair and the suffering and the hopelessness, Lord, you give us a beacon of hope and of light. And we cling to the fact that you are alive and you truly do reign over everything. And Lord, as hard as it might be for us to live without fear today, Would you give us courage? Would you help us to take that bold step of obedience and to trust you in this? For those of us, Lord, who are sick, I pray your healing touch over them now. For those of us who are dealing with anxiety, I pray that you would give them courage. And Lord, that you would give us all wisdom as we seek to discern how best to follow you in these difficult days. Jesus, we love you and we trust you in all things. And we thank you for the glorious hope of salvation that you offer us today. In your name, amen.